I requested from both the health department in San Francisco as well as from the vaccine adverse event reporting system information on the alleged booster shot I had to take when I got my job in the summer of 2013. And I only took one. I think I was supposed to take three. And that one just, it is what it is. And what happened was, instead of the vaccine adverse event reporting system getting back to me to give me the information I needed, I ended up getting trafficked to Austin. And I got trafficked to Austin just in time for the Cannabis Entrepreneur Conference. And while I was there, I tried to go to the Salvation Army. And this was in April. And I entered the Salvation Army, and in the lobby of the Salvation Army, they had a magazine. And I don't remember what the name. It has the main magazine of the Salvation Army. They had it in a newspaper box, like a wire box, in the lobby of the Salvation Army. And on the front of the front cover was a picture, a full page picture of micro tweezers holding what looked like a microchip, and it was discussing nanotechnology. And you open up I got the magazine. You open up the magazine, and while you look at the magazine, you see all these places they've gone, all these missions they have, these updates on missions the Salvation Army has internationally, and it was completely racially coded. The layout is this thing I keep seeing. It's like this program they've been running for years, where there's a specific sequence of racialization, in the rollout of things that happen. There's like a literal programming of different demographic groups one goes through. And this is how it was laid out in terms of the mission here versus the mission there, and then they jump over here and then they jump back. And I looked at the article they had on the nanotechnology, and they were talking specifically about how the nanotechnology was going to help with virology, and that a lot of medical treatment, especially in places like Africa, where they have all of those diseases like Ebola, and that they've been very supportive, and they talked about things in the network. Now, that magazine was there in the lobby, and while I was there, I had this problem because despite going to all these other shelters all over the place, including afterward, right, they required one to get a tuberculosis test. Now, I'd never been anywhere in Texas, or even when I was in Chicago. None of the shelters I'd ever gone to required someone to get a tuberculosis test in order to stay at the shelter. So they gave you a sheet of paper. And there were 3 places you could go to get a free tuberculosis test at certain times, and one was right next door. And at the time in Austin, the setup in Austin was, which they have this in some cities, right in the downtown area. The way I understand it, I'm just going to say it the way I understand it, they have designated overnight clearinghouses where they let homeless people sleep. They corral all of the homeless people into a certain area, usually right downtown, and not necessarily like obvious to the regular people, but it's like 1 or 2 blocks away. So honestly, and I've been through this before. I wasn't drunk at the time, but it reminds me of when I was in Houston. And one day I'm driving, and then I see all of these homeless people, and I'm like, where did they come from? And it gave me this very overwhelming sense of, oh my gosh, like this is scary. And not only that, but the aura that had been put on these homeless people, who at the time I understood were mostly African American, and I believed at the time they were actually Vietnam veterans. And they would, so when you're not used to being around homeless people, and you're not used to having to deal with the actual implications of poverty and this racial injustice as it impacts people economically, and you're doing whatever is considered to be your normal middle class life, and then all of a sudden you're out at a party or you're out in an event, and then you go 1 or 2 blocks off of the main drag and there's all of these homeless people. It's a psychological thing, but it's also an economic thing. Because what happens when that person that's supposed to be on one track and maybe got a little drunk, or maybe just decided for whatever reason, maybe they got into a fight with the person they were talking with, so they want to take a walk around the block and come back. I mean, I've done that before, right? And then you're like, whoa, why are there all these homeless people just sleeping right outside this building? I literally believe that that's part of their civil engineering. I literally believe that that's part of what they did. Because they put these places literally right next to what the main entertainment center is. And then you got to deal with the other things that could go on, like drug dealing, or the other side, which is the Christian recruitment. Literally. That's part of the chastisement, is that they usually associate those homeless people with some sort of area where there's something alleged to be Christian, and it's part of some Christian service. But the actual property is most likely connected to a nonprofit that gets some sort of faith-based sort of tax incentivization or some sort of faith-based designation. But it's literally 2 blocks away from the sinners, right? The sinner stroll. And what happens if the sinners walk a couple blocks away? Well, I'm not talking about crime, right? I'm not talking about these homeless people getting up and going and mugging somebody, and then you got to deal with that, even though that's the fear, right? The fear is, well, you're going to see a bunch of homeless people and that you're probably likely to get mugged by them. Maybe it does happen. But more than likely, what's actually happening is somebody's running a transaction on that person, and then for whatever reason, whether they're intoxicated or upset or just taking a walk, or maybe they're going to somewhere else on the way, they walk through or walk by or walk in proximity to that clearinghouse. Well, there's all kinds of stuff being trafficked through and processed through the homeless people sleeping there. And then you got the psyop of the beat cop that walks by, or the guy that walks by and says, well, it's not 11 o'clock yet, you can't sit down. You can stand, but you're not allowed to sit down until 11 o'clock. And that's what they did in Houston. And they did something similar in Austin, where they had, right next to the Salvation Army, they had another day service provider. And they would let the homeless people sleep on the street outside of this day service provider. And literally 1 block away is where they got their Weird Town thing. Every Saturday, Sunday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday night, Friday and Saturday night at least, they close off the street. They close off the actual street on either side of the street for about, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 blocks. And it's where all the bars are. And it's where all of the restaurants that like the kind of like a nightclub area is. And it's literally 5 blocks away from the Capitol. But in between the Capitol and this sinner stroll, somebody might call it that, it would make sense if somebody would identify it that way, is the Salvation Army with this other day service provider, where all the homeless people sleep outside. And so when you're there and you're seeing all the things that are going on in that regard, that's one thing. But in the service center right next to the Salvation Army was one of the places, presumably, where you could get the free TB test. So you had a certain amount of time where you were supposed to be allowed to get the TB test. And I went there, and I went one day, and I said, I'd like to set up an appointment to get a TB test. By the way, can I see the information on the actual test you're going to use? And it was like one of these weird things. So they came and they gave me a folded up piece of paper. And what it is it's the product information that they put in all of what they would send. I mean, I've seen it before, even though I never had to process things like that. But I recognized what it was. It was like a 2-page folded in half and then folded in maybe fifths. And then it would have been put in a box, right? It would have been put in a box where they would have had the actual product. And the company was called Par Pharmacy, P-A-R. And the first thing that hit me was like golf. I'm like, whoa, wait a second. Par, it has a financial, par is also a financial term. That's not what I got. I got golf. And so I started looking through the information. And the thing that got me is that they also had an antibiotic in there. And the proportions of the antibiotic versus what was listed as the tuberculin toxin were very suspect to me. And so they had that product information written on the actual sheet that they were handing out, that was in the actual product they received. I looked it up online, and the information online about that company and about that product was totally different. So if I had said, hey, what company do you use for your tuberculosis test? And then I looked it up online. What was available online was completely different. Was different than was completely different in terms of proportions, and that was the thing. And then there was other stuff that was going on that was mentioned on the website that wasn't in the paper, uh, and I had it. I had it. I kept it with me. It's in my evidence. My evidence got stolen. And what ended up happening is I went back to that. I was like, I can't. There's no way I'm going to take this tuberculosis test. It doesn't make any sense to me, because what they've got online versus what they've gotten here. What it said in the paper didn't make any sense. To be honest with you, I was pretty certain it wasn't a TB test. That they were. I thought that my first gut was they're injecting a antibiotic that has something additional that is meant to impact the response people have to antibiotics. Why would they do this? And so I was like, this doesn't make any sense, because, I used to work someplace where we administered TB tests, right? And there was a process. You had to go through it. I believe the woman who would come in and administer the TB test was qualified to do it. I believe she was professional. I don't think there was anything about what she was doing or about what we were doing. Now, did the manufacturer of the actual tuberculosis test have something else going on? They may well have, right? And that may have been reflected in the fact that neither San Francisco nor the VAERS got back to me, right? But after I contacted VAERS, I asked for this information. I ended up in Austin, and this is what's going on. And what would happen is periodically VAERS would send me an email that was supposed to be an update or an acknowledgement of my original report. But the night they would send it overnight. And the time stamping was not for the United States. The time it would end up in my email, and it would reflect it in my email, and the time on the actual report, they weren't sending it in connection with or identifying it with or tearing it to the United States. And so what it seemed like they were doing is overnight they were pinging me and running some sort of transaction that they meant to have sent somewhere else. And usually it was Africa. And this happened at least 3 times, and one of them was very, very, very intense, and it was like this real intense stream that mentioned a variety of things that actually were like benchmarks. They were like financial benchmarks that came due later. They came due later, and came due in a horrible way. But what happened is when I was at this shelter, at some point, they said, well, you have to get this TB test or you're going to get evicted. And a couple of nights before they evicted me, there was another woman, and she's like, I don't know what the problem is. I already got the TB test, but they already determined that they were going to evict me, so they said that I didn't get it in enough time. And it was like, what? And so they ended up evicting her. And the thing is that she slept in a bed, and on the bed, there was graffiti on the bed that they never cleaned off. And I was like, it's not incidental. If they leave the graffiti on the bed, and if they leave the graffiti on the wall, they do that deliberately. And that was demonstrated, at the Center for the Homeless, the GRB, and then later here in Dallas, where you go into the pen while you're waiting, you're corralled before Christmas dinner for the homeless, and you're standing there for an hour, and they're clearing all kinds of transactions through you while you're waiting. It's a huge, huge day. It's a huge commercial day for people that use the homeless to launder money. And you look on the ground, and you can't see it very well, but they've gridded off that area. Now, you could say, well, during a convention or something, that would be, well, okay, but we're not at a convention. We're standing here for an hour. And every time the line moves, every time somebody gets to these metrics, at some point in time, there's a ping, and then there's a disturbance right there on those cells. They're using the technology, the surveillance tech in the auditorium, and they're pinging people. And it's like, and my theory is that what they do is they have these things that are like these disturbances while you're corralled and you're waiting. And so it looks like, the guy stayed too close to your daughter or to your kid while he was like distracted on his cell phone. So you yell at him, and he gets hyped because he's got that burst from the cell phone. And then all of a sudden security has to come in and break it up. And what I saw is when that happened, you know who got kicked out? Not him for talking and yelling and screaming at her, but her and her kids got kicked out. That literally happened 2 Christmases ago here in Dallas. And that's the kind of stuff they do. And you're like, well, I mean, it's just a bunch of homeless people on one hand. But then on the other hand, it's like, well, what is that connected to? They're always using homeless people's derivatives for somebody else. It's that ludicrous. It's that ludicrous. There's absolutely no justification for targeting her and her children and kicking them out and letting him stay with his cell phone and talk a bunch of shit about how she should have kept her mouth shut. That's literally what they did. So what is that coded to? What did they connect that event to? And then when you get to the door, and then they say, okay, 7 of you can go, or 10 of you can go. And then the woman stops you until she literally answers her cell phone and transfers it to another goddamn fucking city before you're allowed through the door. Who did they connect you to for that? And that's what they're doing. That's what I honestly believe they're doing with this vaccine. They're doing something different. They've already corralled everybody, and this is their chipping project. So they're going to, how are they going to characterize and classify you? And the thing is, they've been doing this to the homeless for years, and they've been doing it to the undocumented immigrants for years. And at some point, you just didn't pay enough. Well, you were able to get enough undocumented immigrants to pay some part, but we need something else. And it's part of that circle jerk that I was talking about. That game where it's like, well, I don't like this guy. And they're beating this guy, and there's no real just cause for it, and it's completely unconscionable that they're just randomly beating a guy. But he's an asshole, and you don't like him, so it doesn't really matter. And then a little bit later, they're beating this guy, but then it's like, well, it's your boss, and your boss is an asshole, and he deserved it. And then they go to someone that is just someone that's kind of a friend of yours, maybe, and, he didn't really deserve it, and he's not a bad guy, but are you going to take the risk? And then they go to your brother, and then they go to your wife, and by the time they get to you, there's nobody to stand up for you. That's just how it works. And then you start getting bitter, and you start getting jaded, and the truth of the matter is you never get out of that fucking loop until you start beating people. And that's what they're doing. And I'm sorry, but that was what the entire fucking Obama administration was. That was their whole racial justice agenda. And in some ways, it seems like that's what Paris was about. And then you get enough people, enough good old time white people, the whole legacy stock. And if you weren't playing into the stereotype of the slave master and the elite before, and they let see, this is what happened, is that in order to get that buy-in, they had to make examples out of certain white people. There were certain white-skinned people that needed to be made an example of while they were training people of color to take on that particular kind of mentality, that role. And so they chose dissidents. They chose people that there was no reasonable, rational justification for separating from those that were seeking racial justice. And they apparently did it long enough to raise an entire generation of people who think they're entitled to leadership that didn't have any relationship with the people that were targeted. And the people who were able to fly by and were able to, slip by and were able to have some life in the meantime didn't say anything. They kept their mouths shut. They went along with it. And now what's happening? Well, now they need another tier. They need another capital tier. Because they wasted all that shit that they did. And I'm going to be honest with you. I'm just hoping enough of us that got shat on this whole time and that were busted down to the street ended up maintaining enough of a reserve and a resolve that unfortunately you're just going to have to fucking liquidate, guys. They're just going to have to fucking liquidate. You know that whole take a hit now for a long-term gain? Well, you kept hitting, like I said, you kept hitting the same people. You wanted to do what you needed to do to expose what was going on. And there were people that were exposing it. Don't get me wrong. Where are they? Where are the people I was with? They're all genocided. And they're so fucking genocided, I can't even be in a domestic violence shelter with women and children anymore. If I get into a domestic violence shelter with women and children, they kick my ass out within 3 fucking weeks because you can't possibly have a woman in there with you that would be willing to stand up for you. Everything in your fucking life has to be about going to that shelter worker. Everything's centralized into making her feel important so that then she can meet whatever she needs to meet in order to pay off whoever she agreed to pay off. And if you go and you try to organize with each other, I can't even get in touch with anybody. They block all my fucking emails. They literally block all my fucking emails. I can't even talk to anybody. All they want me to do is prove that somehow I'll comply with some sort of command structure based upon my consumer choices. And they justify stealing my evidence because they want me to assimilate to the fact it's about your consumer choices. You decided to consume that information. That's literally what, and so what are you gonna do? What are we going to do? You can't find that magazine from the Salvation Army. You know that? They don't have it online. If you go and you look through the publications for that month have a different cover. Were they just performing a specific psychological operation and or specific kind of outreach in the Austin area during the months of April and May of 2018 when they murdered Barbara Bush? Because that was the magazine they had. I had the magazine. I saw the picture. I had the article. You can't find that information anymore. Why? What were they doing with the tuberculosis testing center next door? That was not a tuberculosis test. What was it? And now we're doing what? Right?